That morning in court, my sister Patricia strode past Mom in a $3,000 Chanel suit, laughing with her husband, as the lawyer asked the judge to declare our mother incompetent, while Mom sat shrinking in old Skechers, hands trembling on the worn leather purse Dad gave her 30 years ago, and Patricia had no idea what I'd hidden in my bag. I'm Chloe. That purse still sits on Mom's table. If you've stayed silent for ungrateful children, hit like. Tell me where you're listening, and let me take you back to the morning it all began. The morning sunlight filters through the windows of the red brick house on Millbrook Road, but it does not bring the same warmth it used to during our family Sundays. My mother still keeps her habit of rising before the rest of the world, but these days, she sits in a stillness that feels heavy and cold. She had already brewed a large pot of Maxwell House coffee by the time I walked into the kitchen. The rich aroma usually meant the house was about to be filled with laughter and the sound of the front door swinging open for friends. She was dressed in her Sunday best, a floral patterned blouse she had kept in perfect condition for years, and she sat upright at the small wooden table. I watched her hands, spotted with age, as they nervously smoothed out the fabric of her skirt over and over again. She was waiting for the ladies from the senior center to pick her up for the morning service, just as they had done every week since my father passed away. The clock on the wall ticked past 10 o'clock, then 10:15, but the driveway remained empty. My mother kept looking at the window, her expression shifting from hope to a quiet, numb confusion. She had no idea that Patricia had spent the previous evening making secret phone calls to every member of that social circle. Patricia used her most concerned voice, the one that sounds like a professional caregiver, to tell them that Mom was no longer strong enough to be out on her own. She told them Mom was having spells of confusion and that it was better if they did not encourage her to leave the house anymore. Watching my mother sit there, facing those empty chairs that were once filled with her closest friends, felt like witnessing the first real scar on her spirit. I stood in the shadow of the doorway, watching her shoulders hunch forward as the reality set in. She did not make a sound, but the way she slowly stood up to pour that full pot of coffee down the sink told me more than any scream ever could. Patricia told me this was all for Mom's safety, claiming she might fall or wander off if we were not there to watch her every move. But looking at her then, I saw that Mom was not fragile. She was just stunned to realize her life was being reduced to these four walls. This supposed care was nothing more than a cage, stripping away the small routines that gave her life meaning. I kept my mouth shut for months because I wanted to believe my sister was doing the right thing. I let myself be convinced that Patricia was the one with the plan, and that silence is a weight I will carry for the rest of my life. My mother was always a woman of concrete numbers. She kept every grocery receipt and utility bill tucked away in an old tin box she hid in the kitchen pantry, a habit of a generation that believed independence started with the weight of your own wallet. In the living room, my father's old lazy boy recliner still sits in its rightful corner, the spot where Mom used to spend every evening on her iPad, FaceTiming the grandkids and watching their digital faces light up her world. It was her one remaining joy, her window to a life beyond these four walls. But yesterday, Patricia took it all away. She confiscated the iPad and the cell phone, claiming that online scams were targeting vulnerable people like Mom. Patricia changed every bank password and told her, with a voice full of unearned charity, that Michael would handle all the bills from now on. The house that Mom paid for with 40 years of double shifts as a nurse has suddenly become a place where she has to ask for permission just to know how much of her own savings is left. I saw the pure, cold shock in Mom's eyes when she tried to log into her account and watched the screen flash that red text. Invalid password. She looked up at Patricia as if she were looking at a complete stranger. I know that feeling. The gut-wrenching moment you realize the child you spent your life protecting is now looking at you as a resource to be managed instead of a human being with a soul. My mother did not argue. She did not scream or demand her rights back. She just let out a small, faint sigh, a sound of silent shattering that echoed through the quiet house. She had always taught us that family was everything, that blood was the only thing you could truly count on. But now, that very trust was being turned into something sharp and used against her. I watched her pull her sweater tighter around her shoulders, as if she were trying to hold herself together before she completely disappeared. I tried to step in, to tell Patricia she was going too far, but she brushed me off with those professional-sounding medical terms about mild cognitive decline. Patricia had brought home a thick folder from a lawyer's office, demanding Mom sign a full power of attorney over to her. Mom sat there at the dining table, her hands trembling as she held the gold pen my father had given her on their 25th wedding anniversary. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for something she did not have the words to ask for, searching for a lifeline I was not sure I could provide. Patricia stood over her, acting like this was just a simple errand instead of a total surrender. I stood in the kitchen doorway, paralyzed by the weight of our history, watching Mom's signature, the same elegant hand that had signed all our permission slips and graduation cards, waver on the bottom line. I stood there and watched the light go out of her eyes as she handed the pen back. And I hated myself for every second of my silence. The financial control was only the beginning. That red brick house on Millbrook, which used to be a sanctuary of peace, slowly began to feel like a place where every shadow was a judge. Patricia brought in a care assistant who was really just one of Michael's people. Someone who looked efficient but had eyes that never quite met yours. I watched this woman move my mother's reading glasses or her blood pressure medication, only to sigh with a manufactured pity when Mom couldn't find them. "I put them right here on the counter, Dorothy," she would say, her voice dripping with a kindness that felt like ice. "You must have forgotten again." This subtle, persistent lying was like a heavy fog rolling in, making my mother doubt the very ground she stood on. I found her one afternoon, pulling a small, frayed notebook from under the cushion of her favorite rocking chair. She was feverishly writing down every small thing. The time she had her Maxwell house, the exact minute she took her pills, even the color of the birds at the feeder. It was the quiet, desperate struggle of a woman trying to anchor herself to a reality that her own daughter was trying to wash away. I was standing in the hallway one evening when I heard Patricia and Michael talking in the kitchen. They were discussing where to place the hidden cameras, treating my mother's life like a set for a movie they were directing. Michael's laugh was sharp and calculating as he talked about collecting evidence for the upcoming court date. He said that if she just forgot to turn off the stove one more time, the whole thing would be over and they could finally get what they wanted. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a cold hand. They were waiting for her to fail, hoping for an accident that could tarnish 40 years of a life well lived. My mother, the woman who had nursed half the town back to health, was being turned into a test subject in the very home my father had built for her. Later that night, Mom called me into her room. She looked so small sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands gripping mine with a strength that surprised me. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fear I had never heard in all my 35 years. "Do you think I am losing my mind?" Looking into her eyes, which were clouded with a confusion that wasn't her fault, I knew the time for keeping the peace was over. My silence, The way I had nodded along just to avoid a fight with Patricia had become a weight on my mother's back. I realized then that being a good daughter wasn't about staying quiet. It was about standing between my mother and the people who were trying to erase her. I do not know if anyone listening today has ever felt this way, as if the people you raised have suddenly decided you no longer know who you are. It is a unique kind of pain to realize your own experience is being treated as if it has an expiration date just because you have seen more years than they have. If you have ever been made to doubt your own eyes or your own memory by the people you trusted most, I want you to know that your voice still matters. Tell me your story in the comments, because we need to hear each other. If Dorothy's struggle feels like something you have lived through, please hit like to send her your strength, and subscribe so you can be there when we finally start to fight back. When you finally decide to look into the darkness, you begin to see everything that was hidden behind the polish and the practiced smiles. I did not find the truth in a lawyer's office or a locked safe. The first real evidence of what was happening to my mother was waiting in a place nobody ever bothers to check. It was sitting right there in the rusted trash can behind the back porch, tucked away under the heavy layers of things we usually throw away without a second thought. I waited until I saw Patricia's car pull out of the driveway, taking Mom to yet another one of those doctor appointments that always seemed to leave her more confused and smaller than when she left. As soon as the sound of the engine faded, I was out at the bins. I started digging, my hands moving past empty cereal boxes and old plastic grocery bags until I reached the bottom. I found hundreds of tiny white scraps of paper, bank statements that had been torn into 1,000 jagged pieces. I brought the scraps inside and spent the next few hours at the kitchen table, my hands shaking as I taped them back together like a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. The smell of the adhesive and the quiet ticking of the wall clock were the only things in the room with me. When the numbers finally lined up, I felt a physical sickness in my stomach. $50,000 had been drained from my mother's 401k retirement fund in just 3 short months. That was nearly half of everything she had left. I looked out the kitchen window at the driveway where Michael had parked his brand new SUV just that morning. He had been so proud of it, standing there in the sun and telling the neighbors it was a reward for his recent success at the construction company. I realized then that the success he was talking about was nothing more than the theft of my mother's future. A cold, steady anger started to crawl up my spine. They weren't just managing her. They were bleeding her dry. That money represented 40 years of exhausted night shifts at the hospital, years where she walked those cold linoleum floors until her feet bled just to make sure she would never be a burden to anyone. It was the result of my father waking up at 4 in the morning for decades, his truck rumbling in the driveway as he went off to work through the winter snow and the summer heat, all to ensure my mother would always have a roof over her head. Now, all that sweat and sacrifice was being treated like a toy for a man who had never understood the value of $1 he didn't steal. I stared at that shiny vehicle glinting in the driveway and felt a deep disgust for people who could sleep peacefully at night while living off the lifeblood of their own mother. I walked down the hall to my mother's bedroom, the air still smelling of her familiar lavender soap and the old cedar of her dresser. I began searching for that little notebook I had seen her with, the one she usually tried to hide when Patricia walked into the room. I finally found it buried deep under the layers of the hand-embroidered quilt she had spent years making, the one with the delicate floral patterns that she said would one day be for my own home. I turned to the final pages and saw her handwriting. It was shaky and the letters drifted off the lines, but the words were clear enough to break my heart into pieces. She wrote about how Michael had asked to borrow $500 for a car repair, But then she noticed the balance in her account was missing thousands more the next morning. "I must have seen the numbers wrong," she wrote in a tiny, cramped hand. "I cannot say anything because I do not want to worry the children or cause trouble between the sisters." I sat on the edge of her bed and let the tears finally come, falling onto the page where she had smudged the ink. My mother was not losing her mind. She was sacrificing her very soul, and she was doing it by choice, just to keep our family from falling apart. The very grace and selflessness that had defined her entire life had become a tool for Patricia's cruelty. "I must not make the children worry." Those words felt like a physical blow to my own months of silence and looking the other way. I realized that my mother had seen every single lie and every single theft, but she was so terrified of breaking the image of the perfect family she had built that she was willing to let them call her incompetent. She was willing to let the world think her clarity was fading away just so her eldest daughter wouldn't have to face the truth about the man she had married. I reached into my bag and grabbed my iPad, my fingers moving with a new kind of purpose. I started taking high-resolution photos of every single page in that notebook and every jagged piece of the taped-together bank statements. This was no longer just a suspicion I could ignore. This was my evidence. I stepped out onto the porch and called an old friend from college who now worked at a prominent law firm downtown. My voice didn't waver this time, and I didn't try to make excuses for my family. I told him that I needed to help my mother reclaim her life, and I needed to do it before there was nothing left of her spirit to save. As I hung up, I saw Patricia's car turning back onto Millbrook Road. I felt a strange, cold calm come over me as I watched them pull in. This was the end of my silence. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the little sister who just wanted everyone to get along. I was the person who was going to make sure my mother didn't have to face this struggle by herself ever again. Patricia did not just want the money in my mother's bank account. She wanted to erase the very person my mother had spent 68 years becoming. She understood that a person's identity is held in the eyes of their friends and community, and she began to systematically poison every long-term relationship Mom had left. It started with a small afternoon tea in our living room. Patricia invited the ladies from the church auxiliary, women who had baked pies and sewn quilts alongside my mother for 30 years. These were the women who had sat on our porch through my father's funeral and shared every potluck dinner we ever had. But when Mom walked into the room that afternoon, I saw the shift. The usual warmth was gone, replaced by a stiff, awkward pity. I saw the way they traded quick, worried glances over their teacups, as if Mom were a child who might knock something over at any moment. Patricia sat on the edge of the sofa, her hand resting over Mom's with a grip that looked like affection but felt like a restraint. Her voice was full of that practiced, sacrificial tone she used whenever she wanted to sound like a martyr. "My mother has been having such a difficult time lately," Patricia told them, her words falling like heavy stones into the quiet room. "We are just so worried that she is beginning to lose her sense of reality, and we are terrified she will wander off if we are not right there to catch her." She even told them a twisted version of a story about Mom almost burning the house down because she forgot the oven was on once. It was a lie, a tiny mistake Mom had made months ago that Patricia had inflated into a catastrophic sign of cognitive decline. I watched my mother stand frozen in the center of the room, the tray of homemade lemon bars she had spent the morning baking beginning to tremble in her hands. These were her friends, her community, the people who had seen her at her strongest. Now, they were looking at her as if she were a piece of old, broken furniture that had outlived its usefulness. The pain of becoming invisible is not that people stop seeing you. It is that they see a version of you that they have decided is a burden, a person without a voice or a valid memory. Mom did not try to defend herself. She did not point out the lies. She just quietly set the tray down on the coffee table and walked toward the back door. The silence in her wake was not the silence of someone who had forgotten. It was the silence of a woman who was simply too exhausted by the betrayal of her own blood to speak. I stepped into the middle of their little circle, my voice cutting through the whispers like a cold wind. My mother remembers exactly who owes how much for the charity bake sale last year, and she certainly has not forgotten the value of a true friend, I said, staring directly at Patricia until she had to look away. I led my mother out to the garden, where the afternoon sun was stretching long shadows across the rose bushes she had tended for 20 years. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the thin, paper-like skin of her knuckles. She looked at me, a tiny spark of her old fire visible behind the tears that would not fall. They think that because I am old, I have stopped feeling the sting of their words. Do they not, Chloe? That question stayed with me long after the tea had gone cold and the church ladies had driven away. When you start listening to the conversations that happen in the shadows of a house you once thought was a sanctuary, you begin to see the true faces of the people you share your blood with. I had reached a point where I could no longer trust my own ears during the day, so I started listening at night. I placed a small digital recorder behind the old Maxwell House coffee tin in the back of the pantry, a spot where the acoustics of the kitchen were perfectly clear and where neither Patricia nor Michael ever bothered to look. This was the place where they held their private family meetings, the ones that did not include my mother or me. I remember sitting in my own apartment later that Friday evening, my headphones pressed tight against my ears, listening to the static until the voices finally cut through. What I heard made the blood in my veins feel like ice. Patricia's voice was sharp and clinical, the same voice she used when she was negotiating a contract at work. She was on the phone with a real estate agent, discussing the house on Millbrook Road as if it were nothing more than a piece of property that had outlived its usefulness. "We need to have this red brick house listed and sold before Thanksgiving," she said, her words coming out with a cold finality. She went on to explain that Mom would be moved into a specialized care facility in Martha's Vineyard, a place she claimed was world-class. Patricia told the agent that my mother was so far gone she would not even recognize the difference between her own bedroom and a clinical suite. But it was Michael's voice in the background that truly sickened me. He was talking about the commission he had negotiated and how that influx of cash was the only thing that could save his construction business from a total collapse. They were not just planning for Mom's future. They were harvesting her life to pay for their own failures. That house is not just a collection of bricks and mortar to us. It is the place where I learned to ride a bike on the driveway while my father watched from the porch. It is the place where every height mark of our childhood is still etched into the doorframe of the pantry, right next to where that recorder was hidden. Every corner of that home holds the ghost of a holiday dinner or the quiet comfort of a rainy afternoon. To see it valued as a liquidated asset, a quick fix for Michael's debts, felt like a desecration of everything my parents had worked for. I went back to the house the next morning and found my mother sitting in her usual spot in the living room. She was meticulously sewing a button back onto a coat for one of Patricia's children, her eyes squinting through her glasses as she moved with a quiet, practiced grace. She had no idea that her own nest was being put up for auction right behind her back. I walked into the kitchen, pretending I had not heard a single word of their betrayal. Patricia was standing by the counter, holding a glossy brochure for a high-end nursing home. She looked up and smiled, that same sweet, empty smile she had been wearing for months. "Look at this, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with that artificial honey that I now knew was meant to hide a sting. "This place has a heated swimming pool and daily yoga classes for seniors. You would absolutely love it there. It would be like a permanent vacation." My mother took the brochure with trembling fingers, her eyes lingering on the photos of elderly people sitting in wheelchairs in a sterile, sun-drenched lobby. She looked out the window at her rose garden, the one she had spent 20 years coaxing into life, and she shook her head very slowly. "But I like my flowers better, Patricia," she said softly. Her voice was small, but there was a flicker of something firm beneath the surface. Patricia just let out a short, dismissive laugh, a sound that made me want to scream. "Flowers are everywhere, Mom," she said, talking as if she were explaining something simple to a toddler. "The important thing is that you need professional care, that we just cannot provide here anymore. It is about your safety." She spoke as if she were talking about sending an old car in for parts instead of moving a human being out of her own home. I watched my mother closely then, and for the first time, I saw her stop nodding. She did not give in. She gripped her teacup with both hands, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. She had heard something in her daughter's tone, a lack of basic humanity that no amount of fancy yoga classes or heated pools could ever replace. She was starting to see the cage they were building for her, even if she was not yet ready to call it by its name. I waited until Patricia went upstairs to take a phone call, leaving her leather briefcase open on the dining room table. I moved quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached inside and found the listing agreement for the house. It was all there: the asking price, the closing dates, and the signature at the bottom. My mother's name was written in a jagged, shaky hand that was a poor imitation of her actual script. It was a forgery, and not even a very good one. Michael had clearly been the one to hold the pen. This was no longer just a family disagreement about what was best for an aging parent. This was a criminal act. I took my phone out and snapped a series of clear photos of every page, making sure the forged signature was in high definition. I could feel the weight of the truth finally settling in my hands. This was the proof I needed to stop them. I walked out onto the back porch, the cool autumn air hitting my face and clearing the fog of anger that had been clouding my mind. I took a deep breath and sent those photos to my friend at the law firm with a simple message. "We have the proof of the forged signature," I wrote, my thumbs moving with a steady confidence I had not felt in years. "Prepare the emergency injunction to stop the sale of the house immediately." I felt a strange, quiet pride blooming in my chest. I was no longer the little sister who stayed silent to keep everyone happy. I looked through the glass door at my mother, the woman who had protected me from every storm for 35 years, and I made a silent promise to the memory of my father. I would be the one to keep the porch light burning. I would make sure that no one, not even her own daughter, would ever be allowed to take away the ground she stood on. Justice was not just about the money anymore. It was about making sure my mother stayed exactly where she belonged. The subtle attacks and the quiet whispers in the corners of the house finally gave way to an open, aggressive cruelty. Patricia had clearly reached the end of her patience. She was no longer interested in just managing the situation. She needed my mother to break completely before we ever set foot in that courtroom. She needed to ensure that no judge or lawyer would look at Dorothy and see anything other than a shell of a woman who was no longer capable of thinking for herself. The air in the red brick house had grown thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe, turning every shared meal into a trial of its own. We were in the middle of a simple lunch on a Tuesday afternoon, just the three of us sitting at the kitchen table with the sunlight hitting the crumbs of our turkey sandwiches. Without a word of warning, Patricia reached into her bag and slammed a thick blue folder onto the table. It hit the surface with a sound like a gunshot, right next to Mom's plate. Patricia didn't sit down. She stood directly over my mother, her shadow stretching across the table like a dark shroud. She leaned in close, her voice rising to a harsh, demanding pitch that echoed off the kitchen tiles. She told Mom to name the last 3 presidents of the United States, and she wanted the answer right then, without a second of hesitation. I watched as the color drained from my mother's face. She sat there, paralyzed, her eyes wide with a shock that looked like physical pain. It wasn't that she didn't know the names. It was that the sheer aggression in her daughter's voice had tightened a shackle around her throat. She tried to speak, her lips moving without making a sound, and then her hand trembled so violently that her fork slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp metallic clang that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. Patricia didn't let up for a single breath. She told Mom that this was exactly what the judge was going to ask, and she claimed that if Mom kept acting this way, the state would have no choice but to lock her away in a nursing home where she would never see her garden or her grandchildren again. I stood in the doorway, my hands clenched so tight that my nails were biting into my palms. It was the most blatant form of emotional cruelty I had ever witnessed. My sister was intentionally using my mother's greatest fear, the fear of losing her independence and being cast aside, to shatter her will. Patricia didn't want Mom to remember. She wanted her to forget. She wanted Mom to believe that she was already a ghost in her own life, a burden that was no longer useful to anyone. As I looked at my mother shrinking into her chair, I realized that some people are capable of a coldness that defies all logic when they let greed take the place of family loyalty. The fluorescent light above the kitchen island flickered, casting a sickly, oscillating glow over the room. The kitchen, which had always been the heart of our home, a place of safety and the smell of cinnamon rolls, felt like a cold interrogation room. Mom looked at me then, her eyes swimming with tears and a desperate plea for help, but she quickly looked back down at her plate. She was terrified that Patricia would scold her for losing focus. "I am so sorry. I just cannot remember right now," she whispered. It was a lie, a painful, heartbreaking surrender just to make the shouting stop. Patricia turned toward me with a look of absolute triumph on her face. She told me to look at our mother and see for myself that she was already gone. That look of victory on Patricia's face made me want to scream, but I forced my breath to remain steady and my voice to stay low. I knew what I had in my pocket. I knew that the digital recorder was catching every single word of this abuse. Patricia was unknowingly building the very walls of her own prison with every insult she hurled at the woman who had given her life. My heart ached for my mother, the person who had spent 30 years teaching us that words were meant to be used for comfort and love. Every tear that rolled down her wrinkled cheek that afternoon was becoming a piece of evidence that would eventually speak for her when she no longer felt she had the right to speak for herself. I walked over to the table, my footsteps quiet on the linoleum. I reached down and picked up the fallen fork, wiping it clean before placing it gently back into my mother's hand. I looked my sister straight in the eye, my gaze cold and unyielding. I told Mom that she didn't have to remember anything that people were trying to force into her head. I told her that the only thing she needed to remember was that I was right there with her. Patricia just let out a sharp, mocking laugh and walked away with a look of pure contempt. Later that night, I watched through the cracked door of Mom's bedroom as she pulled out her little notebook. With a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, she wrote a single line about how her eldest daughter had scolded her and how maybe she really was losing her mind. I reached out and squeezed her hand, knowing that the silence we had lived in for so long was about to explode. I think there are times when you feel absolutely exhausted from having to prove your worth to the very children you spent your entire life raising. It is a weight that no parent should ever have to carry, feeling as if your own history and your own mind are being treated like a problem to be solved instead of a life to be honored. If you have ever been made to feel small, or been told that you no longer know what is best for your own soul, I want you to know that your dignity is still intact. Please share your story with me in the comments, because we cannot let these moments of silence stay hidden in the shadows. If you believe that the respect we give to our elders is the true measure of our character, please hit like to stand with Dorothy and subscribe to stay with us as we head into that courtroom to finally set the record straight. The local courthouse has those heavy oak benches that always feel colder than they should, no matter how much sun is shining through the tall windows. I sat next to my mother, feeling the slight, rhythmic tremor in her arm as she clutched a worn leather purse that my father had bought her on their 30th anniversary. It was frayed at the edges, the color fading into a dull tan, but she held it against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the floor. Across the aisle, my sister Patricia looked like she belonged in a completely different world. She was wearing a tailored navy blue suit that radiated authority and success, the kind of outfit that said she was in total control of every room she entered. I could not stop thinking about the $40,000 missing from Mom's account that likely paid for that very suit. The contrast between them was a physical ache in my chest. My mother, the woman who had spent 40 years taking care of everyone else, looked so small and fragile in her simple floral Sunday dress and her old gray Skechers sneakers. The air in the room smelled of lemon floor wax and the dusty, stale scent of thousands of old legal files. It was an environment my mother never imagined she would step into, especially not to face her own flesh and blood in front of a judge. Every time a heavy door opened, or a clerk shuffled a stack of papers, she flinched. I watched her hands as she fidgeting, nervously adjusting the strap of her bag and then smoothing the hem of her skirt over and over again in a desperate attempt to look presentable. Patricia leaned over to Michael and whispered something, a small, condescending smile playing on her lips as her eyes flickered down to Mom's orthopedic shoes. It was a look that reduced a human being to a broken object, a piece of old furniture that had outlived its usefulness and was ready to be hauled away to the curb. The humiliation did not need words. It was right there in the way they refused to meet her eyes as a person, seeing her only as a problem that needed to be managed. Patricia's lawyer stood up, his voice booming and full of a practiced, artificial gravity that filled the quiet room. He began to read from a list that felt like a catalog of my mother's supposed failures, turning every small lapse in memory into an instrument of incompetence. He spoke about the time she left the stove on, the time she forgot her keys in the refrigerator, and most damningly, the $50,000 she had supposedly lost control of because her mind was no longer her own. Patricia nodded along with every word, her face contorted into a mask of tragic, dutiful concern for the benefit of the gallery. "We only want what is best for her," Patricia said when she was called to speak, her voice cracking slightly at the perfect moment as if she were the one suffering. "We just want to protect our mother from herself before she loses everything we have left as a family." It was a performance that would have been convincing to anyone who had not spent the last week digging through a trash can to find the truth. I looked at my mother as the accusations piled up like heavy stones on her shoulders. She bowed her head, her chin nearly touching her chest, accepting the labels of confused and incapable as if they were the only things she had left to own. She did not know that Michael had spent weeks moving her reading glasses and loosening the knobs on the stove just to create the incidents they were now using to strip her of her dignity. My anger was no longer hot and loud. It had turned into something cold and sharp, a steady pressure rising from the soles of my feet to my throat. This was the woman who had bandaged every scraped knee we ever had, who had worked double shifts through the flu just to make sure we had new school clothes, and now she was being dissected in front of her neighbors and friends for the sake of a car payment and a fancy suit. I felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it made my vision blur at the edges. When the clerk finally called my name to testify, the silence in the room felt thick enough to touch. I stood up and felt Patricia's eyes on me, full of a smug older sister confidence. She truly believed that I would keep the family secret, that I was still the little girl who would rather let a lie live than cause a scene that might upset the neighbors. I walked to the witness stand, my footsteps sounding like heartbeats on the polished linoleum floor. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder of taped-together bank statements and the small digital recorder I had hidden in the kitchen. "Your Honor," I said, my voice surprisingly clear and steady, "my mother is not the one who has lost her capacity for judgment. She has spent the last year carrying a burden that no mother should ever have to carry alone, especially not to protect the very people who are standing here today trying to erase her from her own life." I saw the smile on Patricia's face vanish instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, cold panic. She sat back in her chair, her back stiffening as if she had been struck. I looked at my mother, and for the first time in months, I saw her lift her head. Her eyes were clouded with confusion at first, but then a flicker of a terrifying, beautiful hope began to grow there as she realized I was finally speaking the words she had been too afraid to whisper. I realized in that moment that silence is not dignity. Silence is just a hiding place for the people who want to hurt you while pretending they love you. I was no longer afraid of the family breaking apart. The family was already broken. It had been broken the moment Michael picked up a pen to forge my mother's name on a document that would sell her soul. The only thing left worth saving was my mother's right to wake up in her own home for as long as she lives. I began to present the photos I had taken of the real estate contract and the forged signatures that Michael thought no one would ever see. I explained to the judge how the $50,000 had not been lost to confusion or senility, but had been used to pay off the massive mortgage Michael had taken out in secret to save his failing business. A low, shocked murmur started to ripple through the gallery, the sound of neighbors and church friends realizing they had been part of a cruel deception. Michael looked down at the floor, his face turning a deep, shameful red, while Patricia began to tremble, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "This house was paid off 10 years ago by my father's sweat and my mother's long nights at the hospital," I said, looking directly at my sister. "And our mother knew exactly what was happening, but she did a thing that you will never be able to understand. She chose to be silent and let you call her crazy just so you would not have to face the truth about the man you married." The courtroom fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, everyone waiting for the truth to finally finish its work. In the middle of the noise of the courtroom, between the sharp whispers of the neighbors and the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keys, my mother suddenly became perfectly still. She was not looking at Patricia's tailored suit anymore, and she was not even watching the judge. She was staring into the middle distance, looking toward that quiet and sacred space where the memories of my father were calling her back to the woman she had always been. It was as if she were leaving the cold, sterile room and walking back through the front door of our home on Millbrook Road. She reached deep into her old leather purse and pulled out a small family Bible. The black leather was worn smooth at the corners from decades of her thumbs pressing into the pages during Sunday morning services and those long, quiet nights she spent in her garden chair. I watched her fingers trace the faded gold lettering on the spine, her grip tightening until her knuckles were white against the dark skin of the cover. She was remembering what my father used to say every time our family faced a difficult season or a loss we did not think we could survive. He always believed that the truth was exactly like the morning sunlight coming through the garden window. You could pull the heavy curtains tight and try to live in the dark, but you could never truly hide the sun forever. That verse about the truth setting you free, the one she had read to Patricia and me at the kitchen table 1,000 times, was finally echoing in her mind. She realized in that silence that her decision to stay quiet just to shield Michael from his own choices had not been an act of love. It was just a way of feeding the shadows that were now trying to take everything she had left. Right at that moment, my mother's own brother stood up to testify. He had been coached by Michael, and he began to tell the court that Mom had sounded confused during their last few phone calls. He claimed she could not remember the dates of the grandchildren's birthdays or the names of the streets in her own town. To be betrayed by your own brother, the boy you grew up with in a house filled with love, is a blow that would usually break a person's spirit. But Mom just closed her eyes for a long moment, her breath steady and slow. She was going back to our last Thanksgiving dinner when Dad was still with us. He had sat at the head of the table, his hands resting on the white linen cloth, and he made all of us promise that we would always be honest with one another, no matter how much it hurt. My mother took a deep, steady breath, and I saw her thin shoulders square themselves with a dignity I had not seen in a year. She was no longer a victim of their lies. She was a woman reclaiming her own story. The steadfastness in her posture began to radiate toward me, a quiet and unyielding force that changed the very air in the courtroom. I saw that she was no longer the shrinking woman who was afraid of her eldest daughter's scolding or her husband's disappointment. She was the keeper of the fire for the Hamilton family, the one who held the integrity of my father's name in her hands. She realized then that she did not have to fear the judgment of this room or the betrayals of her own kin. She only had to answer to the quiet honesty of her own heart and the faith that had carried her through 68 years of life. A very small, steady smile touched her lips, the kind of smile that comes when you finally decide that the cost of your silence is finally too high to pay. She was stepping out of the shadows, and for the first time in a very long time, I saw my mother standing in the light. And then, I reached for the final folder in my bag, the one that held the truth so heavy it threatened to pull the very floor out from under my sister's $3,000 suit. It was a quiet truth, a series of documents that would fundamentally change the meaning of every accusation Patricia had hurled at our mother over the last 6 months. I stood up and walked toward the judge's bench, my footsteps feeling lighter than they had since this nightmare began. I placed a set of secret bank statements and a small, leather-bound ledger directly in front of Judge Margaret. These were not the accounts Patricia had monitored. These were the ones my mother had kept in the back of her closet, hidden under the old cedar chest where she kept our baby clothes. My mother did not lose $50,000 to confusion or senility. "Your Honor," I said, making sure my voice was loud enough to reach the back of the room where our old neighbors were sitting. I turned my head just enough to see Michael's eyes go wide with a sudden, sharp fear. My mother spent that money intentionally. She spent it to pay off the massive high-interest mortgage that Michael had secretly taken out against this family's property by forging her name over a year ago. I reached into the folder and pulled out the physical checks, the ones Mom had written by hand in the middle of the night while the rest of the house was sleeping. Each one was signed with her careful, elegant script, and in the small memo line at the bottom left corner of every single check, she had written the same 5 words: to keep Patricia in her home. The courtroom suddenly became so quiet that the only sound left was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the large clock on the wall and the shallow, ragged breathing of my sister. I looked over at Patricia and watched as her face shifted from a mask of concerned grief to a pale, trembling mask of absolute shock. She had spent months using the very proof of our mother's ultimate sacrifice as her primary evidence for Mom's mental decline. She had looked at those missing numbers and saw an opportunity for control, never once stopping to wonder if the woman who raised her was still protecting her, even from the shadow of her own husband's crimes. My mother sat there on the witness stand, her hands finally resting still on her lap. She did not look at Michael with any sense of accusation or anger. She simply looked at Patricia with a sadness so deep and so ancient that it seemed to fill the entire room. In that moment, the core of financial betrayal was transformed into a monument for a mother's unconditional love, a love that was willing to be called crazy just to keep her child from being thrown out onto the street. I moved to the small table where the court's audio system was set up, and I pressed play on the recording I had made in the kitchen. The speakers filled the room with Patricia's voice, but it wasn't the voice the judge had heard earlier. This was the cold, clinical voice of a woman who was discussing selling the family home, while our mother was in the next room baking lemon bars for her. The recording played the sound of Patricia and Michael laughing about how easy it would be to convince a judge that Mom was gone if they just kept moving her things and making her feel small. I watched the ladies from the church auxiliary, the ones who had looked at Mom with such pity during that awful tea party, and I saw them slowly lower their heads in shame. They realized they had been played as extras in a very cruel play. Michael tried to stand up, his face a dark shade of purple as he opened his mouth to protest. But Judge Margaret didn't even look at him. She simply raised one hand, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, and silenced him with a single glance. I felt a massive surging sense of release begin to wash through my body, a physical heat that started in my chest and moved out to my very fingertips. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when my mother was finally seen for exactly who she was. She was not a victim. She was not a confused old woman. She was a silent warrior who had endured months of public humiliation and private gaslighting just to keep the roof over the head of the daughter who was currently trying to take her life away. Seeing the truth laid out on that mahogany table, I realized that my decision to finally break the silence was the only thing that could have saved us. My mother was no longer a ghost in her own story. She was the only person in that room with her dignity fully intact, a bright light standing in a room filled with people who had tried to dim her for their own gain. The silence coming from my mother on that witness stand now carried more weight than all the legal arguments Patricia's lawyer had made in the last 3 hours. She looked at her eldest daughter, and I saw a single clear tear finally break free and roll down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of shame or confusion. It was the first tear of a woman who was finally realizing she didn't have to carry the weight of Michael's lies anymore. Her duty to protect them at the cost of her own soul was finally over, and her own freedom was beginning right there in front of the world. She looked at me and nodded just once, a tiny movement that told me she was finally ready to stop hiding. I think about the thousands of women who might be listening to this right now. The ones who have spent their entire lives keeping secrets just to keep the peace. I know what it's like to carry a burden that isn't yours, to let people think the worst of you just because you love your family too much to let them fail. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the only one holding the truth while everyone else is busy trying to rewrite it. If you are sitting there today, holding on to a secret that is breaking your heart just to keep your children or your spouse from facing the consequences of their own actions, I want you to know that you don't have to carry it alone. You deserve to be seen, and you deserve to have your sacrifices recognized. Please, if this story of Dorothy's hidden ledger touches something deep inside you, I want you to share your own experience with me. We have lived in the shadows for too long, thinking our silence was our strength. But sometimes the greatest act of love is finally telling the truth. Share this with a friend who might be going through the same thing, someone who needs to know that her dignity is not up for debate. Hit that like button to show your support for the mothers who have given everything. And subscribe to stay with us as we watch the final gavel fall and see justice finally find its way back to the red brick house on Millbrook Road. Judge Margaret turned her gaze toward my mother, her eyes softening into a look of genuine respect that had been absent from the room all morning. Mrs. Hamilton, is there anything you would like to say to this court before we proceed? My mother took one long, cleansing breath. For months, I had watched her shrink into the shadows of her own home, but in that moment, something shifted. She finally let go of the handle of her worn leather purse, the one she had been clutching like a shield for hours, and she stood up. She did not use the armrests of the witness chair for support. She stood perfectly straight, her shoulders pulled back and her chin lifted, looking taller and more vibrant than she had in years. The room went so quiet, you could hear the distant, muffled hum of the street traffic outside the heavy oak doors. She did not look at the judge first. She turned her head and looked directly at Patricia, who was sitting just a few feet away in her expensive suit. I might not know how to navigate the new menus on Netflix or remember every single update to my banking app, Mom began, her voice ringing out with a clarity and a steady, resonant strength that made my heart skip a beat. But I remember exactly which day every one of my grandchildren was born. I remember that Sarah wants a chemistry set for her 10th birthday next month, and that little Leo needs new soccer cleats because he has finally outgrown the ones his father forgot to pay for. I remember that Michael came to me 3 times last winter to borrow money to cover his gambling losses, and I remember every single lie I was told at my own kitchen table while I was trying to figure out how to keep your family from falling apart. Most importantly, I remember the value of being honest, a duty that seems to have been lost by the children I raised in the house my husband worked 40 years to pay for. I watched Patricia's face completely crumble as that mask of concerned daughterhood fell away. She bowed her head, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the steady, clear gaze of the woman she had tried to label as incompetent. The room, which had been filled with a heavy and judgmental air all morning, began to ripple with a new kind of energy. I heard the low murmurs from the back of the courtroom, where the ladies from the church auxiliary were sitting, but they were no longer the whispers of pity we had heard at that awful tea party. They were the sounds of profound respect and recognition. I realized then that my mother was no longer the fragile, confused woman who needed a guardian to speak for her. She was the only person in that entire building who was truly whole. She was the spiritual pillar that had remained standing even after the storm of her children's greed had tried to tear her down. Her dignity seemed to fill the room like the first light of a clear winter morning. burning away the fog of every lies Patricia had worked so hard to construct. The autumn sunlight streamed through the high windows of the courtroom, catching the silver in my mother's hair and making her look almost regal against the dark wood of the bench. She reached into the pocket of her floral dress and pulled out that small, frayed notebook she had hidden under the cushion of her rocking chair for so long. She began to read from it, her voice never once wavering as she listed the exact dates and the precise amounts she had spent to protect Patricia's family from the consequences of Michael's choices. She listed the grocery bills she had covered when their credit cards were declined at the supermarket, and the private school tuition payments she had made so the grandkids wouldn't have to leave their friends in the middle of a semester. Those numbers were the undeniable proof of her sharp mind and her even sharper love. Michael sat there trembling, his face buried in his hands as he realized too late that the woman he thought was invisible had been the most observant person in his life. I kept my silence for a long time because I thought that was what a mother was supposed to do. Mom continued, her voice dropping into a lower and more intimate register that seemed to speak directly to the hearts of every person in that gallery. I thought my silence was the only thing holding this family together, a way to keep you all safe from the mistakes you were making. But I realize now that by staying quiet, I let you forget who I really am. I am not a problem to be solved or a debt to be managed. I am not a source of income that has outlived its usefulness. I am your mother, and I deserve to be seen as a person with a mind and a heart that still knows exactly what is right and what is wrong. That sentence hit Patricia like a physical blow, and she began to sob. But they were not the theatrical tears she had practiced for the judge earlier. They were the tears of a daughter who had finally been unmasked by the very grace and bow dung she had tried to weaponize. Mom slowly sat back down, her movements full of a quiet grace that made the expensive furniture in the room look cheap by comparison. She reached under the table and found my hand, her fingers warm and steady as she squeezed mine with a firm, grounding pressure. She was not looking for a way to get even, and she was not asking for any kind of punishment for her child. She just reclaimed her right to be herself. Judge Margaret sat back in her chair, her lips pressed together in a silent nod of absolute agreement, her gaze lingering on my mother with a deep sense of shared understanding. The court clerk stopped typing, and for a long moment, the legal machinery of the building seemed to stop entirely out of respect for the woman sitting in the front row. I knew in that moment that the trial was essentially over. No matter what the final ruling was going to be, my mother had already won the only challenge that truly mattered. She regained her voice. The sharp, dry crack of the judge's gavel echoed through the room, sounding like a physical snap of a heavy iron chain. It was a final, rhythmic punctuation that signaled the end of my mother's long imprisonment within a web of lies. For months, she had been a captive of Patricia's whispered manipulations and Michael's silent thefts, but that sound meant the locks were finally being stripped away. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that usually only exists in the early hours of a Sunday morning before the rest of the world wakes up. Every person in that gallery, from our old neighbors to the court clerks, seemed to hold their breath as Judge Margaret leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her with a look of absolute moral clarity. Judge Margaret did not look at the high-priced lawyers or the worried faces in the back of the room. She looked directly at my mother, and then she turned her gaze toward Patricia. This court finds no evidence of cognitive impairment that would justify the removal of Dorothy Hamilton's autonomy, the judge began, her voice steady and carrying the weight of decades of legal authority. In fact, she continued, The evidence presented today suggests that Mrs. Hamilton is perhaps the most lucid and observant person in this entire building. On the contrary, based on the documented proof of forged signatures and the systematic draining of retirement funds, this court is formally requesting that the local district attorney open a full criminal investigation into the conduct of Michael Miller. The charge is not just fraud, but the intentional exploitation of an elder for personal financial gain. I watched Michael's face turn a sickly ashen gray as he physically slumped over the table, his head dropping into his hands. Two court officers moved silently toward him, their presence a quiet promise that the time for hiding behind family loyalty was officially over. A massive, invisible wave of relief seemed to wash through the courtroom, and I felt the tension that had been coiled in my neck for a year finally begin to unravel. I looked over at Patricia, who was trembling so violently that her expensive navy blue suit seemed to rattle against her frame. She looked at her husband and then back at the judge, realizing that the perfect plan she had built to secure her own financial comfort had just become a prison sentence for the man she had allowed to bleed our mother dry. My satisfaction in that moment was not born out of a desire for pain or a need to see them suffer. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of seeing the truth finally return to its rightful place. My mother did not gloat. She did not point a finger or say a single word of reproach. She simply closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath, her lips moving in a quiet, private prayer of thanks that was meant only for herself and the memory of my father. Justice was not a loud or screaming thing in that room. It was a quiet presence that had finally walked through the doors to stand beside her. I watched as the court clerk placed a fresh set of legal documents on the table in front of my mother. These were the new papers, the ones that would ensure this would never happen again. Mom picked up the pen, the same gold one my father had given her, and she didn't hesitate for a single second. Her signature was firm and clear, the handwriting of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she owned. She signed the documents that revoked every bit of access Patricia and Michael had ever had to her accounts. She officially established a protected trust for her grandchildren's education, placing the oversight in my hands to ensure that the money Dad had saved would go exactly where it was intended. Each stroke of that pen was an act of liberation. It was the sound of a woman reclaiming her future and her home, stroke by stroke. She was no longer a resource to be managed or a problem to be solved. She was the owner of her life again, and every word she signed carried the weight of a person who had finally been set free from the burden of other people's greed. I looked at her then and saw a physical transformation that was nothing short of a miracle. The woman who had been shrinking into her chair for the last few months, the one who had fumbling with her purse and smoothed her dress out of pure nervous habit, was gone. She stood up straight, her posture mirroring the dignity of a woman who had won a battle she never should have had to fight. She adjusted the floral hem of her floral dress with a calm, steady hand, her eyes clear and focused. The independence that Patricia had tried to mock and treat as a symptom of a rotting mind had become the very fortress that now protected her. I realized that the passing years had never taken away my mother's strength. It was only the silence and the constant gaslighting that had made her feel small. Now that she had found her voice, she looked like she could walk through any storm and come out the other side without losing a single hair. As we prepared to leave, Patricia tried to move toward us, her face wet with tears and her voice a frantic, desperate whisper as she tried to make one last excuse. She reached out to touch Mom's arm, but I stepped between them, my own voice calm, but as sharp as a winter frost. I told her that was enough. I told her that she had already received exactly what she had spent the last year planting, and that there was nothing left for her to say to the woman she had tried to erase. We walked out of those heavy oak doors, leaving the muffled sounds of Michael's frantic phone calls and Patricia sobbing behind us. We stepped out onto the courthouse steps and into the brilliant, golden light of the afternoon sun. The air was cool and smelled of dry leaves and the approaching autumn, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like we could actually draw a full breath. Mom stopped at the top of the stairs, looking out over the town she had served as a nurse for 40 years, and she took a deep, steady breath of the free air. It was her first breath of true freedom after a year spent in the dark. I guided her toward the car, feeling the warmth of her hand as she squeezed mine with a firm, grounded pressure that told me everything I needed to know. We didn't need to talk about Michael or Patricia or the money that was gone. We only needed to be there, together, in the quiet of the afternoon. "Thank you, Chloe," she whispered, as I opened the door for her voice small but full of a depth that brought tears to my eyes. That simple sentence was the greatest reward I had ever received in my entire life. It was the confirmation that I had done the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing I had ever faced. I knew then that the red brick house on Millbrook Road would have its porch light burning bright tonight, and for every night after. It was no longer a place of shadows and secrets. It was a home again, restored and protected by the truth that had finally been spoken out loud. A few months later, I returned to the red brick house on a quiet Sunday morning. The porch light was off, giving way to the brilliant sunlight streaming through the garden windows and over the roses. My mother's name, Dorothy Hamilton, stood out clearly on the mailbox of a home that was finally her own again. Inside the kitchen, the rich scent of Maxwell House coffee filled the air. Mom was sitting in her rightful place at the head of the dining table. She was carefully writing a card for one of her grandkids, her hand steady and her mind at peace. There was no more fear here, no more of that heavy, costly silence that had almost buried her alive. Looking at her, I finally understood that the greatest act of love isn't blind forgiveness for your children's mistakes, but the courage to protect your own dignity. Dorothy taught me that the truth doesn't break a family. Only greed and lies can do that. No matter how many years you have lived, you deserve to be respected in the home you built. This house is only truly a home when the woman who lights the hearth is seen with all the value she is worth.